Spider. Not a villain, not exactly a man either. Man-Spider is what happens when Peter Parker's mutation refuses to stop. His first appearance comes in 1984's Marvel Fanfare number 2, written by Chris Claremont and drawn by Michael Golden, when Spider-Man and the X-Man Angel are captured in the Savage Land by mutates working for the villain Sauron. Their leader, Brainchild, straps Spider-Man into a machine and devolves him, dragging his DNA backward toward its most primal state. He comes out the other side a hulking, spider-headed monster, more arachnid than human, driven by instinct instead of intellect. He can still feel. He still recognizes the people he loves. He just can't speak, and he can't stop his body from acting on pure animal hunger. Years later, in Amazing Spider-Man number 100 through number 102, an experimental strength serum backfires and does it again, growing him 4 extra arms before finishing the job and pushing him the rest of the way into the same monstrous shape. He begs Khazar, Lord of the Savage Land, to kill him rather than let him live as a beast. It happens again during the Avengers Disassembled storyline when the villain called the Queen, who commands insects and arachnids, kisses Spider-Man and awakens a long-dormant insect gene buried in his DNA. This time, the transformation runs in reverse. Extra eyes and body hair first, then the full man-spider shape, with Peter's human mind somehow still intact behind the mandibles. Even a mutated toxin from the villain Plantman can trigger a partial version of the same change. The mutation is potent enough to outlive Peter's own body, too. When the villain Vulture later absorbs a sample of the same genetic material, he starts flickering between his human form and a man-spider shape of his own, sporadic and only partially controlled. Proof that Peter's condition isn't just personal trauma, but something that can spread. The form proved memorable enough to leap outside the comics entirely. In the 1990s, Spider-Man the Animated Series built an entire second season arc around Peter's mutation, spiraling out of control, voicing the monstrous form with actor Jim Cummings and sending the show's Spider-Man on a desperate search for a cure from Professor X and the X-Men, borrowing the same basic premise Chris Claremont had planted in the comics a decade earlier and turning it into one of the most talked about story arcs of the entire series. That's the horror of Man-Spider. It isn't rage, it isn't hate, it's watching a hero's mind get buried alive inside a body that no longer answers to him. Every other name on this list chose evil, or had it forced into them by someone else's plan. Man-Spider is the one where nobody's driving at all. Doppelganger. In 1992's Infinity War number 1, the villain Magus used cosmic power stolen during that era's Infinity Gauntlet saga to mutate the greatest heroes of the Marvel Universe into evil duplicates using devices called M-bodies built by the being Anthropomorpho. Spider-Man's double came out wrong in every possible direction. 6 arms, claws, a mouthful of teeth, organic web spinnerets on each forearm firing webbing sharp enough to slice a person apart instead of catching them. Where Peter Parker built a life around careful choices, Doppelganger is a being of pure animal reflex, hissing and growling instead of talking, a mirror of Spider-Man's body with none of the man left inside it. Every other duplicate created that day died when Magus fell. Doppelganger didn't. He was actually killed first, cut down by the demon-possessed villain Hobgoblin during the same event, and then mystically revived by an entirely different demon goblin, Demogoblin, who kept him as a follower for months afterward in the pages of Web of Spider-Man. From there, Doppelganger drifted from master to master. He was captured and locked in Ravencroft Asylum, only to be freed when a group of vampires overran the facility and released every prisoner inside. Eventually, he ended up adopted as a strange pet by the serial killer Shriek during the citywide slaughter known as Maximum Carnage, when Shriek and Carnage recruited an entire family of superpowered killers to tear Manhattan apart. Shriek called him her son. Carnage merely tolerated him, right up until Carnage turned on Shriek in a rage, and Doppelganger threw himself in the way to protect her, taking a blade meant for his adopted mother and getting thrown off a building for his trouble. He should have died there. Decades later, he was still turning up, captured and experimented on by the paramilitary cleanup crew Alchemax. He eventually broke free and was confronted by the villain Scream, who demanded to know the location of his old ally Demogoblin. He simply growled at her and attacked. Doppelganger has been stabbed, shot in half, and thrown off buildings more times than almost any character in Spider-Man's history, and he keeps coming back because his body isn't really flesh at all. It's a living fractal, endlessly reassembling itself into the same nightmare shape. Despite appearing in only a handful of comic stories across 3 decades, fan demand generated by the Maximum Carnage video game adaptation eventually earned him a rare honor for such a minor villain. his own Hasbro Marvel Legends action figure decades after his six-armed debut. Hit the like and subscribe button to see more videos like this. Leave a comment on your favorite evil Spider-Man variant. Let's get back into the video. Zombie Spider-Man. The concept was born almost by accident in 2005's crossover arc of Ultimate Fantastic Four by Mark Millar and Greg Land, when the Ultimate Universe's Reed Richards was tricked into opening a portal to a ravaged alternate Earth. What he found there was so popular with readers that writer Robert Kirkman and artist Sean Phillips spun it into its own 5-issue miniseries by the end of that same year, Marvel Zombies, set on the world now known as Earth 2149. On this Earth, a strange infection carried by an alternate version of the hero Sentry sweeps through the superhero community roughly 40 years before the story's present day, and what was meant to work like a cure for cancer does the opposite. It turns the Marvel Universe's heroes into ravenous, flesh-eating undead, and Spider-Man is one of the first to fall. Infected, starving, and no longer in control of his own body, he kills Aunt May, and then he kills Mary Jane Watson. These aren't villains striking him down from the outside, but they're the two people he swore his entire life to protect, and his own hunger is what ends them. For most zombified heroes in this reality, that's the whole story. Infection, tragedy, monster, forever. But Peter is different. Somewhere underneath the hunger, Peter Parker is still in there, and over decades of wandering a ruined, undead Earth, that spark never fully goes out. When the surviving zombie heroes plot to spread their plague to new worlds and feed forever, zombie Spider-Man turns on his own kind to stop them, choosing the multiverse's safety over his own endless hunger. He spends nearly 40 years as one of the undead, longer than almost any hero in Marvel's Zombies universe survives in that state, and somehow the guilt never rots away with the rest of him. That's what makes zombie Spider-Man different from a simple flesh-eating monster. Even stripped of his humanity, killing the people he loves, the responsibility never quite leaves him. With great power still comes great responsibility, apparently, even from beyond the grave. The concept proved durable enough that Marvel kept returning to Earth 2149 for 2 decades afterward, filling in the fall of its heroes in the one-shot Marvel Zombies, Dead Days, and spinning off further miniseries that kept the undead version of Spider-Man shambling through new Marvel Zombies stories well into the 2020s. Spider-Woman. Not every evil version of Spider-Man is a monster. Ashley Barton first appears in 2008's Wolverine number 67, created by Mark Millar and Steve McNiven as part of their acclaimed Old Man Logan storyline. Some of them just grew up in the wrong world. On the dystopian Earth 807128, 30 years after supervillains overthrew the heroes, Ashley Barton is the granddaughter of Peter Parker and the daughter of an aging Clint Barton, better known as Old Man Hawkeye. She inherits her grandfather's web shooters, but she doesn't inherit his rulebook. Introduced first as a foul-mouthed vigilante nicknamed Spider Bitch, Ashley doesn't fight crime so much as fight for territory, forming her own team of superpowered allies to challenge the reigning kingpin of her wasteland home, Hammer Falls. When her plan fails, she's captured and sentenced to execution, only for her father to break her out, at which point Ashley turns around and kills the Kingpin herself, seizing his empire and his territory as her own. She isn't chasing justice. She's chasing survival in a world that only rewards the person willing to take the throne by force, and her signature line to the men she outmuscles, "Bitch got old," says everything about how she plans to hold on to it. Over the years, she's cycled through nearly as many names as costumes: Spider-Girl, Spider-Woman, Spider-Lady, and eventually Spider-Kingpin, once she's fully claimed the throne she took by force. Later, after a multiversal event called Spider-Geddon rewrote her home reality from Earth 807128 into Earth 21923, she resurfaced as a government agent and, briefly, one of the many Spider Warriors recruited into Miguel O'Hara's Spider Society, even making a background appearance in Across the Spider-Verse. Where most names on this list are pure monster or pure malice, Ashley Barton is proof that in the right, or wrong, reality, being Spider-Man's own blood is no guarantee you'll use the power the way he did. Years later, writer Christopher Priest revisited the character in the series Spider-Force, pairing her with Charlie Parker, a young alternate Peter Parker who'd run away from an abusive home to become a juvenile delinquent in his own right. Two broken reflections of the same Parker bloodline, trying to figure out what family even means in a world this far removed from Peter's own. Patient Zero. On Earth 11080, the apocalypse doesn't start with a supervillain's master plan, it starts with an accident. During a shootout with the Red Mafia, the Punisher unknowingly releases Survivor 118, a Soviet-engineered chemical designed to help humans adapt to a post-nuclear world by letting them eat almost anything to survive. Frank Castle absorbs enough of it to gain immunity. Everyone else isn't so lucky. The first public case comes during a hockey game between the Rangers and the Canadiens, when Spider-Man, mid-fight with the Rhino, is suddenly overwhelmed by the chemical and eats him alive on live television. Reed Richards later explains it plainly. Spider-Man isn't a mindless killer, but his higher reasoning has been switched off, reducing him to a primitive, cannibalistic predator. Renamed Patient Zero by the scientists studying him, he becomes the first and most successful leader of the cannibal tribes that eventually consume Manhattan, drawing scores of the infected under his banner, while rival packs fight for territory elsewhere. When a rival cannibal warlord known as the King of Death slaughters his followers and kidnaps his mate, Mary Jane, Patient Zero does something none of the other infected are shown doing. He negotiates. He tracks down the one man immune to the plague, the Punisher, and offers him a trade: kill the King of Death and save Mary Jane, and Patient Zero will hand over the locations of every surviving, uninfected human left in his territory. Because the Survivor 118 virus has an incubation period of roughly 7 months, it spreads across the entire globe long before scientists connect Patient Zero's public breakdown to the wider outbreak, meaning the world's most famous cannibal wasn't even Patient Zero in the literal sense, just the first case anyone noticed. The Punisher agrees, teaming up with an assortment of Patient Zero's own infected tribesmen, including twisted, feral versions of Deadpool, Black Widow, and Scorpion, and rescues Mary Jane, returning her to Patient Zero exactly as promised. Then, the second the deal is done, Frank shoots him in the head at point-blank range, and the Punisher's grim war against Earth 11080's cannibal plague continues afterward in follow-up miniseries, pitting him against infected versions of Wolverine and the Avengers. Patient Zero is proof that even reduced to a cannibalistic animal, some fragment of Peter Parker's loyalty to the people he loves survives the transformation. It just isn't enough to save him. Patton Parnell. Before the radioactive spider ever bites him, Patton Parnell is already something Peter Parker never was. He lives with an abusive uncle. He experiments on neighborhood animals. He watches his next-door neighbor, Sarah Jane, from his window. On a field trip to Alcorp Industries in 2014's Edge of Spider-Verse number 4, created by Clay McLeod Chapman and Elia Bonetti, Patton reaches for a giant spider out of curiosity, and it bites him. And where Peter Parker's bite gave him a conscience alongside his powers, Patton's gives him only appetite. He can't keep food down, he eats a mouse, then a cat. Each meal makes him stronger, and each one pulls him further from anything human. When his uncle comes home that night, Patton attacks him, transformed into a spider hybrid monster with 8 limbs and eyes, fangs, and a taste for flesh that never stops growing. Uncle Ted later finds his own home filled with the webbed-up corpses of Patton's other victims. He briefly considers using his new powers to be a hero, the same thought that defines every other Spider-Man in the multiverse, and dismisses it as boring. A single sentence that inverts the entire premise of every other Peter Parker across the multiverse, all of whom made the opposite choice. He stopped only when Morlun, a cosmic hunter who feeds on spider totems across the multiverse, tracks him down mid-rampage and drains him for a snack, casually ripping off one of his arms first and calling him barely worth the trouble since he's still a freshly transformed totem. The same hunt for spider totems that would expand the following year into the full Spider-Verse crossover event. His crimes span animal cruelty, stalking, torture, mutilation, and kidnapping before the story is even over, and his name itself is a small, dark joke by the creative team, a tribute to comedians Patton Oswalt and Chris Parnell hidden inside one of the grimmest Spider-Man stories ever published. Out of every version of Peter Parker across infinite realities, Patton Parnell is the one who was rotten before the spider ever touched him. The bite didn't corrupt him, it just gave him teeth. The Spider. Earth 15's Peter Parker doesn't need an origin story to explain his villainy. By the time readers meet him in 2002's Exiles number 12, created by Judd Winnick, Mike McCone, and John Holdridge, he's already a sentenced mass murderer serving 67 consecutive life sentences for thievery, violence, and trading innocent lives like poker chips. Then he bonds with an alien symbiote similar to Carnage, and the criminal becomes something worse. The Spider, a being with all of Spider-Man's agility and none of his restraint. The mysterious Timebreakers pull him out of his cell and draft him into Weapon X, a team built from the multiverse's most dangerous alternates, sent on missions to fix broken realities by any means necessary. Where the Exiles, Weapon X's heroic rival team, fight to help people, the Spider fights for the fun of it, treating violence as recreation rather than duty and unsettling even his own teammates with a Deadpool-style sense of humor deployed in the middle of a massacre. One alternate Ms. Marvel refuses even a passing flirtation with him, noting flatly that he's more interested in acts of violence than acts of love. He appears across roughly a dozen issues of Exiles between 2002 and 2004, first under Winnick and later under writer Chuck Austen, before his story wraps up for good. Despite his reputation, later analysis of his actual appearances notes something strange. For a man supposedly serving 67 life sentences, the Spider is rarely shown committing an on-page atrocity to match it, leaving open the possibility that Earth 15's Peter Parker might have always been a killer, with the symbiote only ever amplifying instincts that were there from the start. He eventually turns on his own team, attempting to conquer the multiverse outright before the Exiles bring him down. He's killed by an alternate Firestar, whose microwave radiation splits the Carnage-like symbiote from his body, the same trick that once saved Ben Reilly on Earth 616. Ben Reilly lived. The Spider didn't. Same science, same symbiote, two completely different men underneath it. Spider-Man, Black Suit King. Not every fall from grace needs another universe. 2008. Spider-Man Web of Shadows imagines a version of Peter Parker's own life where an alien symbiote invasion of New York becomes a straightforward test of character, played out one player choice at a time. After a fragment of Venom's symbiote latches back onto him, this Peter can freely switch between his classic red and blue suit and the black symbiote suit at will, and unlike past encounters with the substance, the suit doesn't fight him for control. It simply amplifies whatever he already feels. Developer Shaba Games built the two suits to feel like genuinely different characters, with the red and blue Spider-Man staying fast and agile, while the black-suited version hits harder and tears through enemies with far less restraint. Every mission offers a hero's choice or a villain's choice, and the game tracks which one he makes. Save trapped civilians, or let a fight finish first, spare a defeated enemy, or leave him to the mob, warn Mary Jane away from danger, or use her as bait. Lean hero and Spider-Man can call in allies like Wolverine or Luke Cage. Lean villain and it's the Vulture and a corrupted Black Cat who answer the call instead. Lean hard enough into the black suit and Spider-Man doesn't just wear the symbiote, he becomes its king. In the game's villainous ending, Peter infects Black Cat with a piece of his own symbiote to save her life, and instead of curing her, it corrupts her the same way it's corrupting him. The two of them end the story ruling New York's entire symbiote horde together. On the game's Nintendo DS version, defeating a super symbiote leaves him ruling the city outright, alone. In the game's single darkest scene, exclusive to the villain path, a black-suited Spider-Man shoves his old enemy Eddie Brock into the engine of a helicarrier and kills him outright, watching the resulting explosion destroy the Venom symbiote for good. It's one of the only tellings of this story where nobody bites Peter Parker, brainwashes him, or swaps his mind with somebody else's. He's simply given the exact same power and every single choice along the way, and left to decide for himself which version of Spider-Man he wants to be. It also marks something of a first for the character. Web of Shadows was the first open-world Spider-Man game built around an entirely original story, unconnected to any film, comic, or prior continuity, giving this particular fall from grace nowhere else to hide behind. Pestilence. When the ancient mutant apocalypse needs a new horseman of Pestilence, he doesn't pick a villain who's already earned the role. He reaches across the multiverse and mutates an alternate Peter Parker into one, using cosmic technology to strip away whatever hero he used to be. This version of Spider-Man rides alongside Angel as Death, Cable as War, and the Blob as Famine, each one a corrupted alternate of a familiar Marvel hero, and together they become one of Apocalypse's deadliest strike teams. Pestilence doesn't just fight with strength anymore. He carries disease itself as a weapon, capable of threatening to suck the marrow out of Deadpool's bones during one confrontation, a threat gruesome enough that the heroes facing him, including Cannonball and Siren, treat him as a serious lethal enemy of peace rather than just another costume thug. There's no tragic backstory here, no gradual fall from grace. Apocalypse simply looks at Spider-Man, sees potential in his powers, and rewrites him into a plague-given human shape, sent out alongside the rest of his horsemen on a mission to hunt down the missing Cable across the width of the multiverse. Pestilence is eventually defeated in battle against Marvel's heroes, but the Horseman concept keeps resurfacing across Apocalypse stories for a reason. Turning a hero's powers into an instrument of decay is one of the cruelest inversions Marvel can do to a character built entirely around protecting others. Negative Spider-Man. Created by Dan Slott and Phil Jimenez, and first appearing in 2007, Mr. Negative gets his name from photographic negatives because his own transformation flips his skin, hair, and costume into their exact color opposites. In his human identity, Martin Lee is the philanthropist known publicly as the founder of the FEAS-IT homeless shelter. Underneath that, he's a crime lord whose touch can corrupt or heal depending on how he chooses to use it. When his touch lands on someone pure-hearted, the corruption runs deeper than it would on an already flawed person, and few characters in the Marvel Universe are as stubbornly good as Peter Parker. After being touched by Mr. Negative's power, Spider-Man's costume flips its colors, red swapping for blue, the shades growing darker across the board, and his loyalty flips right along with it. Negative Spider-Man becomes an enforcer for the Sinister Six, fighting the very allies he'd normally be protecting, his moral compass simply switched off rather than gradually worn down. It's a rule Mr. Negative relies on throughout his criminal career, whether he's brainwashing college students at Empire State University into committing crimes for him or forcing hostages to hand over an antidote at gunpoint. The better the person, the more devastating the inversion. He's used the same trick on Aunt May directly, too. After she witnesses Mr. Negative murder one of his own henchmen, his corrupting touch doesn't just silence her, it rewrites the sweet, endlessly patient woman who raised Peter into someone filled with malice and rage. Insomniac Games later reintroduced the character for a new audience in Marvel's Spider-Man, recasting Martin Lai as a Chinese billionaire and FEAST founder who becomes second in command of the Sinister Six under Dr. Octopus, a separate continuity where Peter resists the corrupting touch rather than succumbing to it. Turning Spider-Man himself into a weapon against the Sinister Six's enemies remains Mr. Negative's most personal victory in the comics, proof that even the most virtuous hero in New York is only one touch away from becoming his own worst enemy. Ultimatum. For years, Marvel fans assumed there was no Miles Morales native to the mainstream Earth 616 universe. Marvel first teased the mystery in Miles Morales, Spider-Man number 10 introducing a hooded figure who mentions the name Ultimatum only to strike fear into Wilson Fisk without yet revealing who he really is, until Spider-Man 2 confirmed it, and he was nothing like the hero readers already loved. The Earth 616 Miles fell into crime young, working for the Rigoletto crime family and ending up in Rikers Island, all while building a close, genuine friendship with Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, the same man who's terrorized nearly every other Spider-Man in existence. When the multiverse-spanning event Secret Wars merged realities together, this criminal, Miles, crossed paths with the heroic Ultimate Miles Morales, and the two Peter Parker successors became each other's most personal rivals. Calling himself Ultimatum, he stole advanced equipment from an alternate Avengers roster, including gear built by Iron Man, Captain America, and Hank Pym, and dragged an entire alternate universe Green Goblin back to Earth 616 with him. Together they turned Osborn's blood into a street drug called Goblin, sold across Brooklyn, creating an entire syndicate of goblin-warped addicts in the process. When his uncle Aaron Davis, the Prowler, tried to deliver a chemical on his behalf, Ultimatum simply explained the nature of the multiverse to him and knocked him out cold when he'd outlived his usefulness. He eventually confronted his heroic counterpart directly and revealed the twist that had been building the whole time. He wasn't some invader from a distant world at all, but the real Miles Morales of Earth 616, meaning the hero Miles had spent the whole story defending was the actual trespasser in his own city. Ultimatum isn't chasing world domination for its own sake. He's chasing the life stolen from a version of himself who never had to make the choice he did, obsessively trying to reunite with an alternate version of his lost love, Barbara Sanchez, even briefly finding a version of her in another universe before that relationship also collapsed and drove him back to reclaiming Brooklyn. Good Miles was shaped by his parents, his best friend Genki, and Peter Parker's mentorship. Ultimatum had none of that. Same spider bite, same city, completely different family standing behind him. Superior Spider-Man, no variant on this list, did more damage to Peter Parker's life while wearing his actual face. In 2012's Dying Wish storyline, running through Amazing Spider-Man number 698 to 700, a dying Dr. Octopus, his body wrecked by decades of battling Spider-Man, uses an Octobot device to swap consciousnesses with Peter at the exact moment Peter tries to save him. Peter wakes up trapped inside Otto's decaying body. Otto wakes up in Peter's. When Otto's borrowed body finally dies, Peter dies with it, not before implanting one final lesson about power and responsibility into his enemy's mind, leaving Otto Octavius free, rejuvenated, and permanently in control of Spider-Man's life. The twist was controversial enough among readers that it made headlines well outside the usual comic shop crowd, and Amazing Spider-Man number 700 went on to rank as the fourth best-selling comic of that entire year. Calling himself the superior Spider-Man, Otto sets out to prove he can do the job better than Peter ever did, and by his own ruthless standards, he actually tries. He builds a citywide surveillance network of Spider-Bots, threatens the mayor of New York, and assembles his own private army of young protégés he calls the Spiderlings, alienating the Avengers and torching the public trust Peter spent a decade building. But he also finishes Peter's unfinished doctorate, starts his own tech company, Parker Industries, and even arranges cutting-edge medical treatment that lets Aunt May walk again after years of injury, achievements Peter himself had never managed to pull off in over a decade of struggling to balance heroics with a normal life. He breaks up with Mary Jane Watson, unwilling to carry Peter's old relationships, and falls in love instead with his doctoral supervisor, Anna Maria Marconi. Relatively early into his stolen career as a hero, Otto even goes out of his way to erase what lingering traces of Peter's consciousness he can still detect in his own mind, determined to assert total uncontested control over the body and the life he's taken. For a while, Otto genuinely believes his life, Peter's life, has never been better. Fragments of Peter's consciousness keep surfacing anyway, a conscience he tries and fails to fully delete, until an all-out assault by the Green Goblin's underground army forces Otto to confront the one thing his intellect could never replicate, Spider-Man's willpower. He returns to Parker Industries, the same building where his scheme began, and deletes himself, handing Peter's body and life back to its rightful owner to save the city one last time. Otto set out to prove that ends justify means. Instead, he proved that even trapped in someone else's mind, some fragment of Spider-Man's decency refuses to die quietly. Spider-Goblin, the most personal evil Spider-Man in Marvel Comics, doesn't come from another universe, another timeline, or another body. He's the real one. Earth 616 is Peter Parker, corrupted from the inside by the actual sins of his archenemy, Norman Osborn, in a saga that unfolded across writer Zeb Wells' recent run on Amazing Spider-Man. After Norman is mystically cleansed of his darkest impulses, that discarded evil doesn't simply vanish. It possesses Spider-Man directly, and while wearing Peter's body, it secretly uses the mind-altering Winkler device. The same brainwashing tool once used to convince an innocent reporter, Ned Leeds, that he was really the villain Hobgoblin, and later used by the villainous Queen Goblin after she got her own hands on the device, to plant a hidden trigger phrase deep inside Peter's own head. Years later, Norman activates that trigger, and Peter transforms into Spider-Goblin, a hybrid supervillain in a twisted Spider-Man and Green Goblin costume, unleashed against the Sinister Six with a brutality and sadism that has nothing to do with the man Peter usually is. This isn't a costume swap or a symbiote bonding. It's Spider-Man's own mind being used as a weapon against him. Engineered years in advance by the one villain who knows him best. Spider-Man briefly snaps out of the transformation just long enough for Norman to reclaim his sins by force. But the fight isn't finished. Peter eventually chooses to willingly absorb Norman's sins entirely rather than let the Goblin keep tormenting him from a distance, trapping the battle for his own soul inside a mind-writing device powered by the sentient living brain. And in the most recent chapter of this fight, it's the Goblin-corrupted version of Peter who gets the last word, boasting to a helpless Norman Osborn, "I beat Spider-Man, and now I am Spider-Man." Every variant on this list proves the same uncomfortable truth. Give Peter Parker's power to the wrong mind, or twist the right mind far enough, and the friendly neighborhood hero disappears completely. Which evil Spider-Man do you think is the most dangerous? Drop it in the comments.